So now that you have an understanding of what child abuse is, we're going to discuss what your responsibilities are. This stuff is really important. And at the end of this, we need people to have an understanding of what the member protection policy is, understanding the Tennis Australia Safeguarding Children guidelines, differentiate between what is acceptable and unacceptable behaviour in and around children, understand what constitutes a child protection concern, and then taking that appropriate action if you have identified that there is a concern. The member protection policy, we cannot highlight enough that if you haven't read it, give yourself 10 to 15 minutes and go and read it, because essentially it'll spell out in black and white what you can and can't do, the expectations. And by way of how everything is structured within tennis, everyone watching this presentation, you are bound by the member protection policy. And we have found that a lot of people don't know that. And so this is part of spreading that message that if you haven't read it, that's fine. But now you need to actually go and do it. And part of that policy, which is probably really relevant to everything around child safety, is once identified, you are bound by the policy to actually report any concerns around child abuse and neglect. The Safeguarding Children guidelines, and it's important to probably differentiate some language here, guidelines as opposed to policy. So policy is enforceable. Guidelines is what's created so that's considered best practice. They've been developed to help you meet your obligations under the member protection policy. So it's like bringing elements of the member protection policy to life, make it more operational. It'll clearly define what's acceptable behaviour around children. And just as an example, within the guidelines, there's topics on supervision, the use of electronic communication, the giving of gifts, overnight stays and sleeping arrangements, adherence to professional boundaries. And we're just going to take a quick snapshot of some of those sections. This comes directly out of the guidelines, and it will give you an understanding of the way that it's written. It's very simple English, it's easy to follow. And if people can apply these best practice principles, then it'll go a long way in terms of providing that safe environment for our children. So, and this is a pertinent one within tennis, and this is complex across all sports, even other organisations. So you're thinking education, it is so hard to take photographs of people these days without sort of being in breach of potentially some law. So the idea around the guidelines is to give clubs, so say if you're in that tournament space, you're running a tournament, lots of kids, how do people know who the official photographer is? Are they clearly identified? Are they visible? Has that been communicated? Or are we just going to allow a free-for-all and just let everyone just take photos? There are some sports now where there's like a blanket ban on any photos being taken by anyone. And there's just only one, being the official photographer. So pulling this information straight out of the guidelines, you've got here, personnel may only photograph children to whom they provide services to, when the child is participating in tennis services, programs or events. And only if, and this part's important, so we need that, and I think as a sport we do this pretty well, but this again just spells out in black and white, we need that consent, we need that prior approval from the parent or guardian, and that the context is directly related to tennis. In tennis, this is one, that the child is appropriately dressed, posed. So for example, are you going to take a lot of photos of, say, a 12-year-old girl who's serving and her skirt's flying up? My advice, don't do that one. And the image is taken in the presence of other personnel. But then again, you're going to have that, ideally, that one person who's going to be identified as the tournament photographer. That is the person responsible for the images. That's just one small part of it. Because after all the photos are taken, I guess like as a club, and talking to some more of the club environment here, but coaches as well, you need to know and you need to have some controls around how that data is managed. And here are just some points, again, coming out of the guidelines. These images are not to be distributed to anyone without management knowledge or approval. So if you're going to distribute anything out, someone else needs to be involved in that decision-making process. And ideally, it needs to be someone from above the person who's taking those images. They've got to be stored, so the data needs to be stored in a manner that prevents unauthorized access. How is a club going to manage that data? Is it going to be like a sign-in, sign-out procedure? Where is the camera kept? Who has access to that camera? And if someone does, how do we know? So there's a lot of considerations to take into account when you just want to take photos. But these are some of the things that people need to start discussing at their committee meetings and really sort of squaring away the who, what, when, where, why, how. And if you can start to cover off some of those questions, that's how you're going to sort of, I guess, complete your own risk assessment in terms of when we take photos of children, are we doing the right thing? Are we meeting or certainly making our best effort to meet the guidelines? Another big one, and this is just another example coming out of the guidelines, is the transportation of children. It is really hard these days to, again, cover off all the bases to safely transport people around, regardless of age. So Reese and in consult with some others actually did a really great job of creating a transport approval form. And later, all this information is already on the website, the Tennis Australia website. And I'll go through that and I can show you where all this information sits. So with that transport approval form, if you follow the bouncing ball and tick all the boxes and put the right information in, then basically you'll get to a situation where the guidelines have been met. So some of that information can include the mode of transport, the reason for the journey, the route to be followed, which is important to note that it is preferred as always be the shortest, most direct route, not just going on a scenic tour as you take some kids home. Details of anyone else who is present. So is there another person in the vehicle at the same time, or however you're transporting them? Who is this person? How much do we know about them? And this may seem simple, but this actually has come up before. Whoever is actually transporting, so say for example, if you're driving children, can you actually make sure that you're licensed? Because if it comes out later that for whatever reason, if you're in an accident, and one of the first things police will do is when they get your license and they'll say, I'm sorry, Reese, but you haven't had a license for 10 years, then that's going to create a whole nother world of issues later. And for some people, that just might seem quite logical, but you would be surprised at how many people actually drive around with either no license or even their license has expired and they haven't actually renewed it. It's important to note, even outside of all that, that there will be situations where there's every potential that the guidelines are very hard to meet. And that's why they're called guidelines, because there has to be some areas of, I guess, like flexibility within that. So to give you an example, and this is taken somewhat from remote regional Queensland, and it's in terms of transporting children and where the guidelines can't be met. So this club, and I'll expand on the story a bit, this club has a large group of kids who come from a very low socio-economic part of the town, demographic. It's often they don't know where their parents are. So straight away, in terms of being able to transport them safely, the guidelines have trouble being met because these people cannot get consent from their parents because no one knows where they are. And this actually happens. So what happened then is we had a discussion around trying to involve more people in the decision-making process. So they were very proactive in this, brought in police, spoke to the local Department of Health Child Services. Everyone was on the same page. Yes, we hadn't really obtained the parental consent that we needed to meet the guidelines, but then doing something like this, at the end of the day, if something bad was to happen, it would still be satisfied that these people have made the best effort to provide a safe environment. So it's important to note that for whatever reason, you find yourself in a situation where you can't meet the guidelines, there are still other ways that you can do this. And it's always better to do something than to do nothing at all. So again, involving more people in the decision-making process. Another example would be you're leaving the club as a coach or committee member and there's a child just standing at the front door, just waiting. They don't know where their parents are, they can't contact them. Are we just going to walk away and leave that child there? The simple answer is no. So then what do we do? You speak to the child. You can't get hold of their parents. Where do we go to from there? So you've got to start to think outside the box. Start to bring other people in on the decision. Call your colleagues. Start sending off emails. Make some notes. And again, thinking worst case scenario, if no one can come up with a solution because maybe no one was home. So we just can't drop a child home, even though we know that they live there. We're satisfied knowing that. But if they don't have any supervision, we just can't sort of leave them there and then drive away, because then straight away our duty of care is done. So again, and this does happen, if you found yourself in that situation, we haven't met the guidelines straight off because we haven't even got sort of maybe parental consent. You start bringing in the other agencies. It's okay to call police saying, I've got this child, I don't know what to do with them. I can't get hold of mum and dad. There doesn't appear to be anyone home. They'll literally say, thank you, leave the child with us, we'll look after it. You can make some notes of that, and then to me, that goes a long way, saying that even though the guidelines haven't been met, you've made every effort to get the child to a safe environment. Failing the police, you could always go to, or you can ring your local Department of Child Services or Health, and they'll be able to tell you what to do with the child. So again, the guidelines provide best practice, but we realise at times, in certain situations, parts or elements of the guidelines may not be able to be met. There are other things that you can do.